Welcome to the Rest is Politics Question Time with me, Alastair Campbell.
And me, David Gauke.
Now, David, I want to start with a question about you and about the man that you're sitting in for, Rory. Robbie Meeks. David is clearly Rory's political hero, don't we hear it? So that begs the question, who is David's political hero and why?
Well, I think it would be rude of me not to say Rory Stewart.
But that wouldn't be true, so let's have a truthful answer.
No. Well, I mean, Rory is a bit... I mean, I did campaign in the leadership race in 2019. I suppose I don't really have sort of one political hero. So I have sort of moved politically more towards the centre. I was a big Margaret Thatcher fan. I still am, actually. I think she was a great Prime Minister. But I find a few areas of difference. I suppose in terms of, in my time in Parliament, I thought Ken Clarke was terrific. And, you know, here was someone who knew what he thought, practical, robust, but moderate, thoughtful, really impressive. So I got to know him more actually in my last few years in Parliament. I mean, he was an MP before I was born, and we finished at the same time, and we were kind of allies in the sort of events of 2019. But I thought Ken Clarke was a pretty splendid fellow.
That's good. I'm pleased to say that my nephew is standing for Labour in his constituency, so hopefully that will become a Labour gain. Who else then? Go back in history.
So go back in history. So Robert Peel, if we want to go back there, I thought a Conservative Party leader, largely formed the Conservative Party, but then sort of split. He was sort of at the moderate end and lost out to the sort of more extreme Little Englanders type. So I suppose I have a degree of empathy there with Robert Peel. I'm more pro-Gladstone than Disraeli. I think I'd rather approve of Gladstone as a sort of treasury man and the sort of fiscal orthodoxy and the free trader aspect of it. So that's kind of where I would come from there. I think Churchill was obviously a sort of great figure, flawed, but a great figure. So those are a few. Next question, we got one from Jordan Coombs saying the POA, the Prison Officers Association, are calling for a royal commission into the whole criminal justice system. Given the crises in prisons, what do you think is required to save a prison system in crisis? Will it take the death of an officer or another strange raise a riot?
Well, that's interesting. I think Jordan Coombs, if I'm right, is the POA representative at Hull Prison. I think I saw that on his social media. And there's the question also from Mike Sear. Given the excoriating report on Wandsworth Prison, how would you propose to convert it from a warehouse back to a functional prison? I mean, Rory and I talk a lot about prisons, as you know, but I do think we are sleepwalking to a terrible disaster in some of these prisons. And I'm sure that's why Jordan's asking that question when he says, will it take the death of an officer or another strange ways riot? Assaults on prison officers are pretty high. Conditions for prisoners in some of our older prisons are terrible. I was very pleased as the World This Weekend on Sunday devoted virtually the whole of their programme to the issue of prisons and this report on Wandsworth in particular. I just wonder, from your perspective as a former Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor, do we take prisons seriously enough, not just in terms of the punishment side, but also the state of our prisons estate?
Not really. It's not a big enough priority. We face some big challenges, some long-term and short-term challenges. So there's issues at the moment. We've got a lot of prisoners on remand, and that's putting a great deal of strain on the prison population. You know, we are pretty well at capacity, which is not where you want to be. You've got a lot of overcrowding, makes it very difficult. If you've got a troublesome prison, you actually want to reduce the population, get it back under control. The fundamental issue, though, is our prison population has grown very rapidly. So you go back to 1993, we had something like 43,000 people in prison. Today, it's more than double that. It's 87,000, I think, we've got in prison. And our incarceration rate, by European standards, is really high. So for every 100,000 people in Norway, 55 are inside. The Netherlands, 65. You get to Germany, it's 67. France, it's 107. England and Wales, it's 143. It's 141 in Scotland, largely the same. So, that's a big prison population and largely caused by longer sentences, which have successive governments have
Constantly
imposed, constantly demanded. And there is always a debate saying, if you really care about this issue, then there should be a specific crime with a longer sentence and so on. And over time, that just builds up. Now, if we're going to do that, then we have to spend a lot more money on new prisons. Keeping someone inside is expensive. It costs you £35,000, £40,000 a year, I think, for every one person inside. I can't help thinking if other countries can cope with much lower incarceration rates. In fact, if we could cope with much lower incarceration rates, in the 1980s, then there must be a better way, because putting people inside, very hard to prepare them for the outside world, very hard to rehabilitate. It's important we do more of that. I think it's been a consistent focus of recent justice secretaries about employment and what have you. But when the prison population is under the pressure that it is, we're always going to struggle to cope. And frankly, prison spending is not a priority with the public. There are no votes to be won on this issue. I wish it was otherwise the case, but there aren't. And it's always going to be the case that it's going to be an underfunded area.
Yeah, but that's why. I mean, I really do hope that Keir Starmer, with his background and his history, he knows more about this probably than anybody. And I'm sure he also knows that the system as it works is failing. And ultimately, we talked earlier about short-term, sorry, that was a different episode, wasn't it? So, I think that we need a completely different approach on this. And I agree it's politically difficult. But if we're serious about tackling the underlying problems that have led to this doubling, then we've got to stop this kind of idea that anybody who does anything wrong has got to get banged up. And, once they're there, we forget about them, which feels to me is where we are now. I'm hopeful, by the way, that we're hoping to do an episode of the podcast in a prison with the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk. So it's something Rory and I both think and talk a lot about. And so we're looking forward to do that.
Okay, one from Ian Bellis. Will Labour get much of a post-election honeymoon, if any? And closely related, how does Keir Starmer keep the balance between change and renewal? And we can't fix it all immediately.
Will there be much of a honeymoon? I suspect that if Labour get a majority, there will be a sense of widespread relief that the Tories have gone. I think that will give them the space for a lot of goodwill and hopefully a lot of energy. But I don't think it will be long, because I think that the challenges that the Labour government will face are going to be enormous. I think the press will become pretty vile pretty quickly. I think you're already seeing the starting of that. With Angela Rayner, to a lesser extent with Keir Starmer. I then think that people's expectations, even though, as the questioner suggests, Keir Starmer's trying to keep them relatively low, he's not promising the earth. He is saying a decade of national renewal. This is going to take a long time. But the expectations of change will be, I think, pretty high. So getting that balance right is going to be a real problem. And we're seeing it in Australia. We're seeing it in Germany, where governments that have come in, as it were, from the right to the left, I think they do get judged more harshly, more quickly. And that is a big challenge. And we talked in the main podcast about the need for Labour to have that sense of government project. That is what I hope somebody's thinking about very deeply.
And in a honeymoon period that might be quite short, should the priority be prolonging the honeymoon or do the difficult stuff early?
Do the difficult stuff early. I think look, the honeymoon will be whatever it is. I used to keep we had a very, very long political honeymoon, and I used to keep in my left-hand drawer in my desk in number 10, I used to keep these cuttings of Sunday write-throughs that the big Sunday broadsheets do, which started, this was the week where the Blair honeymoon finally ended. And they went on for about 3 years. So, but Keir will not get a 3-year honeymoon, absolutely guaranteed. So I think you do have to think about the long-term difficult things and get them done. So let's go back to one of your times. You were part of Theresa May's cabinet. What sort of honeymoon did she get?
Well, actually, to be fair, her first year was a bit of a honeymoon period. So
without an election,
the period before the election. Yeah. So she came in 2016 after the referendum. Politics actually wasn't that much about the referendum, really, for that first period. Certainly, Cabinet wasn't talking about Brexit very much over
Really?
that period. No, not for the first year, hardly at all.
What, the elephant was in the room
It
then
was
as
the
well?
elephant. Well, it was all, something was going on, but there was things were kept really close.
Yeah.
So within Number 10, and she was making speeches, and her party conference speech that October, where suddenly a load of red lines were announced.
Yeah.
And the
You
rest
didn't
of the
know about
cabinet.
that?
No, we didn't know about that.
Wow.
So that was held really tight. But
And there
curiously,
was us being criticised for not consulting the cabinet.
No. Well, if you if you talk to sort of Philip Hammond, and the sort of recent Tim Shipman book sort of covers some of this, the extent to which people didn't really know what was happening at that point.
And what about 2017?
2017. Well, no, that was
all...
the opposite of honeymoon. So
what is the opposite of honeymoon?
I suppose so. It's just whatever it was. It wasn't very pleasant. Not as much fun as honeymoon, I would say.
No.
So obviously Theresa May had lost her majority, and there was a spell of can she stagger on, which she could, but immediately the wind was taken out of the government. We had no majority. We had this huge task of Brexit ahead, and I think the writing was on the wall pretty well immediately. We got the election results that night.
Okay, David, here's one for you. Well, it's one for both of us, I guess. Jez back. Why does politics ignore the southwest, especially Somerset, Dorset, Devon and Cornwall, when looking at big funding? Do you think that's true? Funding?
I'm not sure it's necessarily right on funding. Look, I mean, there are big projects. There's a big issue in the southwest, I think, at the moment over things like HS2, or there was a bigger issue when HS2 was going ahead, of saying, well, we're not getting any benefit from this. What was the point? I think there is something about how in the national media the southwest doesn't get that much attention, partly as a political battleground, partly because it's largely, not completely, but largely conservative Liberal Democrat, rather than the big issue that determines who's Prime Minister, which is the Conservative Labour battle. So the focus will tend to be more on the kind of red wall or the traditional marginal seats, mid-sized towns. But because Labour aren't really, other than in the cities, they're not usually a big player in the southwest of England. So I think it gets obscured. 2015, one of the big stories of that general election was effectively the Lib Dem wipeout in the southwest as we took all their seats.
Yeah.
And that, I think, caught people by surprise. It didn't really get the media attention it might have done. There's a big story there that went under the radar until the results came in. Now, this time round, this general election could be really interesting. There are some seats where Labour, in fact, are very competitive, not just the usual, Plymouth and Exeter ones, but one or two others. And the Liberal Democrats are definitely hoping for a big revival in the southwest. So a lot of southwest conservatives.
So it could be quite important.
It could well become more important.
I can remember when Schröder was German Chancellor, and he was chairing the summit where they were sorting out European Union structural funds. And I think I'm right that the moment when he told Tony Blair to hau ab, do you speak German?
I don't, I'm afraid.
Well, hau ab basically means F off. Was when Tony decided he needed to go back into bat to get more money for the Highlands and Islands and Devon and Cornwall. So we were fighting for Devon and Cornwall, and admittedly we didn't win everything we wanted that time. But I think there's another point worth making here. Who's the most Western member of the cabinet?
Ooh.
Do you know the answer to that?
I don't know. No, I don't know.
So for example, when we were in government, we had so many very, very prominent members of the government who came from the northeast. Tony, obviously, Sedgefield, Alan Milburn, Jack Cunningham, Mo Mowlam, Steve Byers. We had a whole range of cabinet ministers who were from one region, and I think that probably did help that region. I can remember when David Penhaligon was the MP, Liberal Democrat MP for Truro, and I remember he had a profile beyond his area and almost beyond his party, and he's tragically got killed in a car crash. So you need those MPs who are going to project a region. You also, of course, do need, this is why it's so sad, I think, that Bristol decided to get rid of their mayor. I think having those big figures, we've seen it in the recent mayoral elections, big regional figures, I think can help a region.
I'm sure that's right. I suppose Rishi Sunak comes from Hampshire, which is not the southwest, but it is southwest adjacent.
Yeah, but he's an MP for North Yorkshire.
But he's an MP for North Yorkshire. But yeah, there's over the years, Jacob Rees-Mogg, of course, famous Somerset MP, Liam Fox.
No longer in the cabinet.
No longer in the cabinet.
Liam Fox, he was Bristol.
It's another Somerset seat.
Okay, Liam Fox, Somerset, but he's not in the cabinet. So none of the Devon and Cornwall MPs are. So I think maybe I guess what we're saying is select yourselves.
Yes, get
select yourselves
some
great cabinet material MPs.
That's the way forward. Paul Rivera, do you have an opinion on the independent movement in Catalonia?
Well, I have an opinion on everything.
Of course you do.
But
I've noticed.
Well, these are, we talked a lot on the podcast about all these elections going on, and I don't suppose there are that many regional elections that we cover. But I think the Catalonia elections are very, very interesting because the socialists have won. And that does appear to be an endorsement of Sanchez, the Prime Minister, the National Prime Minister, who's been trying to normalise relations, not least through an amnesty for those that were, some of them still on the run because of the referendum that was called and their reaction to it. The numbers, so basically what's happened is the independentists are no longer able to form a majority. So it's a big, big win for Sanchez and the socialists. And where that takes the independence debate, I don't know, but I suspect in a backwards direction.
It does seem to be. And is there a wider pattern? Because Matthew Parris had a piece at the weekend suggesting that what's happening in Catalonia, what's happening in Scotland, Quebec, separatist movements seem to be running out of steam a little bit. Do you think there's a general pattern here, or is this a one-off?
Well, I wonder whether part of it is that the pattern is less about separatism than about incumbency. So in Scotland, I think it's partly been about the SNP have been in power for so long, so their central message is being rejected. And likewise, I think a little bit with Catalonia is this sense of, are we ever going to talk about anything apart from independence? Are we ever going to get on and just try and deliver the stuff that we want delivered? So I don't know whether it's anti-separatism. I also do think, sorry to go on about my, the elephant in the room, I do think that Brexit, the consequences of Brexit for the UK has had an impact around Europe and beyond, of people saying, playing around with these long-established constitutional arrangements can sometimes do more harm than good.
Brexit, a force for conservatism, constitutional conservatism.
Is that what it is?
That sounds good to me. God. Yeah.
Is that why you were? Now listen. While we're talking on elections, last week we had a long discussion about the South African election, and we got a lot of feedback. Some of it very, very positive, but one piece of feedback from a few people, and I wish I'd picked it up at the time because it sounded wrong, but Rory gets so upset when you rebut him live on air. Here's one question we got from Pierre Novelli. Can you please fact check the completely wrong South Africa statistics from your more recent episode? The statistic that he's referring to is Rory said that there were now 300,000 white South Africans, and I think he was looking at a briefing paper that was referring to one city. The facts are there are over 4.5 million white South Africans. So apologies to all who listened to what I hope was otherwise a very informative debate about the South African elections.
Alastair, we've got a question. I think you'll enjoy this one. Get your teeth into this. From just down as Queen Mary University. The Prime Minister is using a key sector as a plaything in a doomed-to-fail election campaign. Increasing international student numbers was a strategy 5 years ago. They bring in billions of pounds. How do we prevent this gambling with the security of the country for one party's election campaign?
Yeah. Well, I think you can get your teeth into that as well. I'm sure you don't disagree with me that much on that one.
On this one, I think no. I think we will be agreeing agreeably. So no. I mean, it's right to point out it really wasn't that long ago where the government was saying we want to bring in 600,000 international students. They bring in an awful lot of money. They cross-subsidise British students. It increases our soft power. All these people go off around the world, looking back fondly, one would hope, on their time in the UK. Now it's all about tightening up immigration numbers. And I have to say, I agree with the implicit message in The question, I think this is short-sighted. I don't think this is in the interests of the country. I think it's absolutely right, by the way, to deal with bogus colleges and abuses of the system. And there was an issue. I remember when we came in 2010, we did feel that there were some abuses of the system that need to be addressed. But overall, international students seem to me really important for this country. It's an important export sector, if you like. We should be teaching as many people as possible as we can.
Absolutely.
In this country.
And you mentioned soft power there. We did some polling recently that you probably heard us talk about on the podcast, and our university sector is a massively important part of our soft power, because it's where we can provide intellectual leadership. As you say, there are people who, some come here and settle and they make a contribution in all sorts of different ways. Others come here and then they go to the rest of the world. But there was a guy on the radio this morning from a Kurd who was talking about, he was in Kurdistan and he was talking about, I can't even remember what he's on about, but he made the point that he knows Britain well because he was educated here and he's got very, very fond memories, etc. That stuff matters. And I think that, we talked on the main podcast about Rishi Sunak's strategy, and it feels to me like he is somebody who, if he was given a free hand, would not be necessarily saying what he says about the university sector, but he's being pushed into it because he thinks he has to keep this kind of right-wing tail attached to the dog, and as a result, they're wagging him.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think at heart, Rishi Sunak is a bit of, I would describe as a sort of treasury man, which is, focus on the economy, do the right thing, economically, grow the economy as much as you can. I mean, there are lots of areas where we would, he and I might disagree on what it would be, but I think those are what he aspires to do.
Yeah.
And I think that the treasury argument on international students is to be very pro. Stop the bogus ones, but honestly, they add to the economy and they make us a more dynamic nation. So I think there is a degree in which he is pandering to the anti-immigration right of the party. So, Alastair, I think this is a question for you from Kaiser. Why do the Labour left seem to hate Starmer more than Sunak?
Good question. Very, very good question. And I think there's something in it. I suspect it's not that they don't loathe Sunak for kind of being a Tory Prime Minister who's, entitled and not elected and all that stuff. But they certainly put their energies into attacking Keir Starmer much more, partly because there have always been elements inside the Labour Party for whom politics begins and ends in the debate inside the Labour Party. Mm-hmm. I think you have some of those in the Tories, but fewer. And secondly, I guess because they think that he stood on a deliberately, this goes back to what we're talking about in the main podcast when Morgan McSweeney was helping him become leader of the Labour Party. I think they understood that to win and to get the votes needed to win, he was going to have to project himself to those who had voted for Jeremy Corbyn. And I think that was a very deliberate strategy, a pretty ruthless strategy in its own way, because most of those promises have either been watered down or some of them completely ditched. So I think that's probably why they basically don't think that he's the same as Jeremy Corbyn. Now, the trouble with that, from their perspective, is that plays completely into Keir Starmer's strategy for the broader public, which is to say, yeah, you're right, this is not Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party anymore. But I think that's the simple answer. Have you got any reflections on that?
Yeah, it seems to me that it's a particular attribute of the far left that politics is a lot about purity. It's a lot about how virtuous I am. It doesn't really like to get itself into the sort of grubby business of winning votes. So I think there's a large element of that. I think there probably is a genuine sense of betrayal, if you like, as you say. I mean, look, there's always, as far as I can see, in the Labour Party, a desire to feel betrayed.
Mm. I mean, it's a specialist subject. I mean, look, Neil Kinnock had it. Yeah. John Smith had it. Tony Blair had it. You were always attacked for selling out the Labour Party and not understanding the Labour Party. That's another one they give. And they're almost always, I'm going to get a lot of abuse for this, but they're almost always the kind of, the very well-educated, pretty well-off people who tell you that you're selling out the working class.
Yes, I think that's right, and I think there's an element of I think there are more people on the left who enjoy opposition. Yeah, there are a lot of there's no real pressure. You don't have to take responsibility. You can be very high-minded.
I think, by the way, Nigel Farage is the same.
A little bit, yes.
I think Farage is somebody who would run a mile from government. He can talk the talk, but I think he'd find it very, very difficult. And I suspect that when it looked in the Theresa May's election that Jeremy Corbyn might win, I suspect Jeremy was pretty terrified at the prospect.
He wasn't alone. He wasn't alone. But
my God, that was the easiest. That was well outside the off stump, wasn't it?
But no, I agree. I mean, I don't think that's Jeremy Corbyn ever began a political career with a sort of one day I want to be in Downing Street. I want to seize the levers of power and do things. And I think that's where there is a sort of big temperamental difference between, if you like, a lot of the extremes, more commonly found on the far left. Whereas I think the Conservative Party historically has always been
obsessed about power.
Power. Yeah. The purpose of the Conservative Party is
to be in power. Yeah, and to stay in power.
Yeah.
And then occasionally have a little breather, and out you go, refresh your batteries and come back. Let's hope this time it's a long rest. Talking of winning and losing, somebody called Never Right with a W. This is definitely one for you, though I fear I may have my views as well, and I know that Rory would not have views on this. Views on Ipswich Town's promotion 2 seasons straight. But seriously, why don't we invest in grassroots sports for kids? Well, I'm completely up for that one. I was at a wonderful event the other day. It was the 50th anniversary of Islington Boxing Club. And they were doing this fundraiser. And actually, Frank Warren was there, the boxing promoter. And he was saying, why don't Labour just come out and say that they're going to reverse all the stuff that cuts to youth clubs and, put a bit of money, more money into grassroots sports. And I'm totally up for that. So I hope Labour do more for that. But let's put the big serious politics to one side. I'm so happy to have a podcast co-presenter to whom I can say this. Let's talk football. I mean, first of all, can you understand people who don't like sport?
It's beyond me. To be fair, some of my best friends don't like. My wife doesn't really like sport, but no, I live and breathe it, and for me, football and cricket, and particularly over the last 2 years, my love of football has deepened again to levels.
So we should tell listeners you're an Ipswich Town fan.
An Ipswich Town fan. Grew up in Ipswich at a time where they were incredibly successful.
Was that sort of Bobby
Robson era? And I mean, I can go on at enormous length about the time I met Bobby Robson when I was a child and all that sort of stuff. And then we were, small club that was, we were winning trophies in Europe, we won the FA Cup, we were runners up in the old championship 2 seasons running. I sort of followed them when I was going to games, generally sort of on the decline, and then they were kind of up and down, but dropped down to the 3rd tier. Got this marvellous, fabulous new manager, Kieran McKenna, got us promoted from the 3rd tier last season. Hope we'll do okay in the next level, and then finish 2nd in the championship, promoted 96 points, Premier League next year,
replacing
Burnley, and commiserations. But look, I would say the championship, Alastair, lots of goals, lots of wins.
I love the championship. I've always loved the championship.
Big party at the end of the season. I mean, we've just had a lovely time.
Yeah, of course you have. No, I've always loved the championship, and I was at the game on Saturday at Tottenham, and I wasn't terribly surprised by it. Of course,
are you going to bounce back? Straight back up? Parachute money?
I don't. Yeah, it should be in a strong position, but nothing. No, it's like the election, David. Take nothing for granted until the balls are kicked. Take nothing for granted until the votes are counted. We should close by mentioning one of the most iconic figures on this podcast, which is Darren Bent. Which thereby guarantees us even more coverage on TalkSport, because every time we talk about Darren Bent talks about us talking about Darren Bent. So where did the Darren Bent thing come from?
On the podcast?
On the podcast, because it's become quite a thing.
You tell me. I mean, Rory, as we have discussed, is not renowned for his knowledge of footballers. And yet, sort of every other episode, he seemed to be talking about Darren Bent.
But wasn't that because you must have mentioned Darren Bent?
No, I don't think it was. I don't think it was me, but I did for his birthday.
I know.
Did.
I was there.
Yes. So what do you get the man who has everything for his 50th birthday? Well, of course, the answer is you get him a big, poster of Darren Bent, framed picture of Darren Bent, which I did. I tried to get it signed. Unfortunately, I couldn't get hold of Darren at the time.
Darren, we know you're listening. Darren,
he didn't respond to my appeal. His agent didn't respond to my appeals.
We don't deal with agents. We just go straight to the...
Yes.
Straight to the
I should have known. Well, I'm not as well connected as you.
Well, you should have got in touch and we'd have got Darren on. I'm sure Darren would love to sign your signed poster. I must admit, when we've done the podcast with Rory and he's been at home, I've not yet seen it in the background. So we need to find out where it's hung.
No, quite. I was in his London house the other day and searching all over, couldn't find it anywhere.
Wasn't there?
Yeah, it must be in Scotland.
It must be in Scotland, yeah.
But no, so I left this present for him at their party that I saw you at, and sort of left on the Sunday morning, got a text that evening from Rory saying, David, thank you for the lovely present. Who is it?
Oh, no.
So
even after we discussed Darren Bent, after Darren Bent had talked about this on his radio show.
Yeah. How many other footballers' posters were you going to get for your birthday? So anyway, I went back. It's Darren Bent, of course. And, he said it was lovely. But where it is, I don't know. You ask him. I mean, maybe I should come in with a question for next week.
Absolutely.
Where's the bloody Darren Bent poster?
Darren Bent poster? Yeah. And I think that we should, Darren, if you want the former Tory cabinet minister who does know about football to talk to on the programme, particularly about Ipswich Town, if you can't get Ed Sheeran, David Gauke's your man. David, thank you for being here. Thank you for 2 excellent episodes. Thoroughly enjoyed them. And we'll see you again next time he goes on a retreat.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.